Hey guys, this is Dave with Gazaudio, and this is the Fosi Audio K5 Pro Desktop Gaming Headphone DAC Amplifier. Now, admittedly, I'm not really a gamer, but I do still think I can make a pretty decent assessment of this device, if not from a gamer perspective, then from an audiophile perspective for sure. So as usual, we'll go over the contents of the box, talk about the specifications and design, and then we'll jump into the sound. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Included in the box is the K5 Pro. You also get an optical cable, a 2-in-1 USB Type A or C to Type C cable, and then a 3.5 millimeter headphone splitter. One side plugs into the 3.5 headphone output and the other into the microphone input. So of course this would be for use with headphones or IEMs with a built-in microphone. The K5 Pro is priced at $79, so it definitely does fall into the entry-level or budget category. That being said, it does have a pretty decent amount of power output, and it also has some pretty useful features as well. So let's go ahead and go over the inputs, outputs, buttons, and knobs. First, in the front, we have a 3.5 millimeter headphone output and then a 3.5 millimeter mic input. We then have our input indicator lights, some treble and bass controls, and then a volume wheel that when long pressed powers the unit on and off, and then with a single press switches between inputs. On the back, we have a Type C USB power and audio input, an optical input, coaxial input, and then a pair of analog RCA outputs in case you have a pair of active speakers. So that's on the outside. On the inside, we have a triple S1700 DAC chip, which I've never heard of, and it's paired with a NE5532 op amp. And according to the specifications sheet, it puts out 1 watt at 16 ohms, 500 milliwatts at 32 ohms, and then 80 milliwatts at 300 ohms. Of course, the number you probably want to pay attention to is the 500 milliwatts because 32 ohms is kind of the standard with most headphones. But the takeaway here is that the K5 Pro is pretty versatile and it can handle a pretty wide range of impedances. As far as decoding, it can support 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz up to 24-bit 96 kilohertz. The build quality is also quite good for the price. It appears to have an all-metal chassis. All of the inputs feel pretty tight, as do the knobs. It's also fairly small, which is nice, especially if your desk space is limited. And it also includes little rubber feet on the bottom to help it grip the desktop and to minimize movement when plugging or unplugging from the device. Okay, let's move on to the sound. So of course I tested the K5 Pro with a wide range of IEMs and headphones in different price categories, but also having different power requirements. So I used budget IEMs and headphones like the Magic 1, Sivga Lawan, Meze 99 Classic, but then I also tested it with some higher end stuff like the Elysian Diva, the C-Audio Hakuya, the Hi-Fi Man Aria Stealth, and then my Odyssey LCD3s. And of course, part of my testing routine includes checking for background noise as well. And for that, I used my 2020 Andromeda. Speaking of which, I did actually pick up on a small amount of background noise with the Andromedas, but again, it was only a very faint or small amount. And then I heard basically no noise at all using almost everything else. So unless you have really sensitive IEMs, you shouldn't have any issues with that. Now, I also tested all of the different digital and analog inputs, and they all worked as they should. I used the optical and coaxial outputs from my K19 with no issues, and then went directly into the USB for my PC. That worked fine. And then I tested the RCA outputs, and those worked great as well. And of course, I also tested the EQ, which seemed to work pretty well. I don't typically use EQ, so the bulk of my testing was done with the EQ flat. But again, I did try it for testing purposes. Now, as you can see, it only gives you bass and treble controls and no mid-range controls. And from the information that I was able to find, it looks like it gives you, and there's different information out there, but these numbers seem to match up a little better with my experience. It gives you about 14 dBs of bass increase, or approximately a 12 dB bass cut, and about a 10 dB treble increase, or a 12 dB treble cut. So you have quite a bit of adjustability available with EQ. Now, whether or not the implementation is good, that's a separate issue, because it sounds like the bass was bleeding into the mids quite a bit when I turned up the bass, and it did start to sound quite muddy even when I only turned it up a little bit. Otherwise though, for this price range, I do think it's a nice addition, and I do think there are those who will find the EQ feature useful for gaming purposes. It's just not something I typically use for music, and again, I did not use it during the bulk of my listening. Now, as far as drivability, again, Fosi Audio claims this can put out 500 milliwatts at 32 ohms and 80 milliwatts at 300 ohms. And that did seem to align with my experience for the most part. I really didn't have much of an issue reaching good volume levels with any of my headphones, and the sound quality didn't seem to change or degrade even when I pushed it at higher output levels. So the general implementation of the amplification section of the K5 Pro seems to be very good, and its general performance seems to be quite consistent no matter what volume I was listening at. Which brings us to the sound quality. So, does the K5 Pro sound good? Well, considering it's only $79, it sounds very good. And while it may not have what I would consider to be a purely linear or transparent sound, it's still transparent enough as to not be a distraction, and I could still easily enjoy listening to music. And the characteristic that I felt caused it to lean away from a more linear presentation was the bass. It seemed to be a little bit thin, almost as though it was rolled off just a little bit. And it primarily affected male vocals, but also some instruments that typically land in the low mids, mid bass, and the bass frequencies. They just didn't seem to have the note weight or body that I was used to hearing that was typically present with some of the other devices that I was comparing it with, like the FIO K11, Hi-Fi Uno, or even Fosi Audio's SK01, which also has a similar issue, but it seemed to be a little more prevalent with the K5 Pro. Then I also did some comparisons with some of my portable USB dongles that are roughly in the same price range, and I noticed the same thing with those as well. So with the EQ flat, its bass, mid bass, and even the lower mids sounded a little bit thin. It just put a little more of the focus on the mids and treble. Now, I didn't notice that issue on the opposite end of the frequency spectrum in the treble, as far as the treble sounding rolled off or lacking presence. As a matter of fact, the treble presentation was quite good, and for the most part didn't sound sibilant or harsh at all. Cymbals, hi-hats, and some of the higher frequency instruments that land there seemed to be fairly accurately rendered, and for the most part sounded correct or natural. So I guess the main takeaway, though, is that when you step back and you look at the presentation as a whole, because of the bass energy sounding maybe a little bit thin or reduced, it does give the K5 Pro a brighter, or you might even say a more clinical presentation. But here's the thing, with a slight adjustment of the bass knob, much of that missing note weight or richness can be restored back into the presentation. But again, you do have to be careful, because if you turn the bass up too much, it can also start to muddy the sound up somewhat. So I guess the questions are, is the K5 Pro a good value? And depending on your usage, are there better sounding options out there for the price? And the answer to the first question is absolutely, without a doubt. The K5 Pro is a great value, especially when you take into consideration everything you get for the price, as far as its versatility with all the different connection options, its power output, the EQ, if that's your thing. Although the addition of Bluetooth or a balanced output would have been great, but I think that's kind of a nitpick. Now, whether or not there are better sounding options out there, in my opinion, there are. Personally, I prefer the sound of the iFi Uno or the VOK11. Both of those devices are roughly in the same price range. They're a little more transparent, and while they don't necessarily have all the features that the K5 Pro has, they still have everything else I need as far as connectivity and power output. And since I'm only using it for music, I would prefer a device with a more linear and transparent presentation. All in all, though, I do think the K5 Pro is a solid product, and no doubt there will be a lot of consumers that will find it to be a great addition to their gaming or desktop setup. So that concludes my review of the Fosi Audio K5 Pro. If you're new to the Giz Audio channel and you like our videos, please take a minute and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to go a step further, you can also support us through our Patreon. I'll be sure and leave a link in the description. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch. Please like this video. Please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.